Ava. Peace and stillness. Ava's fame arrived early. At 19, she was already in demand, flying from city to city, her face glowing from every poster and magazine cover. Photographers called her name like a chorus, and crowds pressed in to see her smile. But when the lights faded and the hotel doors shut, silence filled the room like a weight. She couldn't sleep without pills. The noise of attention had turned into an unbearable quiet, and in that quiet, she began to feel the hollow space fame had carved inside her. One night, exhausted and unable to rest, she reached for something, anything, to distract herself. In the drawer of a hotel nightstand, she found a small, forgotten Bible. She opened it without thinking, and her eyes landed on a verse that seemed to reach through the page and touch her directly. "Come to me, all who are weary, and I will give you rest." She stared at the words for a long time. They were simple, but they felt alive, almost spoken. She didn't cry that night. She simply stopped pretending she was fine. For the first time in years, she felt seen, not by an audience, but by something infinite and kind. Months later, Ava walked away from the industry. She checked into recovery, silenced her phone, and started over. Her days were slow and ordinary, washing dishes, making coffee, sweeping floors at a small church cafe. At first, she missed the thrill. But as time passed, the stillness began to heal her. The peace she found wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, steady, like the morning after a storm when the air feels clean again. Today, Ava teaches meditation and scripture, reading to women in recovery. Women who, like her, once tried to fill emptiness with noise. When she speaks, her voice carries both softness and strength. She says, "Stillness was where I finally heard God speak." Then, with a faint smile, she adds, "And once I heard Him, I realized that was the only voice I'd ever been searching for." Mia, purpose in forgiveness. Mia's story began in ambition. She was fierce, determined, and convinced that success meant control. Every choice, every sacrifice, every late night, she called it empowerment. And for a while it felt that way. The money, the attention, the validation, all of it fed the image she built to prove she was unstoppable. But somewhere along the way, the image became a cage. She couldn't tell where the performance ended and where she began. Years later, she woke up in a hospital bed after an overdose and realized her life had become a business contract, her worth measured in what she could give, not who she was. Her turning point came quietly. An old friend reached out and invited her to a Bible study. She almost didn't go, expecting stares, whispers, and the sharp edge of judgment. Instead, she found warmth. No one asked for her story. No one demanded an apology. Someone simply looked at her and said, "You're safe here." Those 3 words pierced through the walls she'd built. In that moment, years of shame and self-loathing began to unravel, thread by thread. Forgiveness became her mission. Not the shallow kind spoken once and forgotten, but the kind that reaches deep into the parts of the soul that still ache. She didn't seek it from the world, because she had learned the world's forgiveness was conditional. Instead, she sought it from God, and hardest of all, from herself. The process was slow and painful, but each prayer, each tear, each surrendered memory became part of her healing. Today, Mia mentors young women through faith-based recovery programs. She listens to their stories with the same gentleness that once saved her. In every session, she reminds them that redemption isn't about perfection, it's about returning. She often tells them, "Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means I no longer owe my pain an explanation." Then she smiles softly and adds, "It means I finally let grace have the last word." Elena, community in redemption. Elena grew up in a deeply religious family, the kind that spoke often of grace, but wielded shame like a warning. Every misstep was met with scripture, every question with silence. By 16, she had learned to smile through guilt and hide her doubts. So she left home young, determined to build a life without rules, without judgment, without God. For a while, it felt like freedom. She modeled, traveled, and built a following that fed her need to be seen. Fame came quickly. So did the loneliness, the drinking, and the pills that helped her sleep. What had once looked like liberation slowly became another kind of prison. Her breaking point came during a late-night shoot when her body gave in. She collapsed under the lights that had once made her feel alive. When she woke, it was in a rehabilitation center sponsored by a local church. She expected lectures, maybe pity. Instead, she was met with something she'd never experienced before: quiet compassion. The volunteers who served her meals and prayed with her never asked about her past or how she'd fallen so far. They just showed up day after day, offering food, prayer, and sometimes just silence. It was in that silence that something in Elena began to shift. The faith she had run from didn't return with fire or thunder. It came softly, like a whisper she had been too proud to hear. Slowly, she learned that grace was not a rule to obey, but a gift to receive. After completing her recovery, Elena left the industry behind. She enrolled in college, studied social work, and began helping others walk the same difficult road she had traveled. Years later, she married one of the volunteers, the man who had once brought her dinner, and listened without trying to fix her. Together, they now lead an outreach program for women struggling with addiction, offering the same kind of patient love that saved her life. Elena often tells her group, "Community healed what confession could not. I found God in people who stayed." Then she pauses, eyes bright with gratitude, and adds, "Love didn't lecture me back to faith. It quietly waited until I was ready to come home." Jordan, conscience in ruin. Jordan wasn't a performer, he was a director, efficient, ruthless, and proud of it. For him, people were products, and fame was formula. Then one day, a performer overdosed on set. He sat in the ambulance, holding paperwork soaked with tears that weren't his. Something inside him broke. He left everything, the money, the company, the name, and volunteered at a homeless mission. There he met an elderly chaplain who told him, "If you want to redeem your life, use what you know to tell a better story." Jordan listened. Today he produces documentaries on recovery and faith. His conscience became his career. Leah, acceptance in honesty. Leah never sought fame. She entered the industry quietly and left the same way. Years later, sitting in a small-town church, she listened to a sermon about the woman caught in adultery, the one Jesus refused to condemn. When the pastor said, "No one threw a stone because no one was clean," Leah couldn't hold her secret anymore. After the service, she told him everything. He smiled and said, "Then you understand grace better than most of us." That moment changed her life. She now runs an anonymous hotline for women trapped in exploitation. She rarely gives interviews, never uses her full name, but the women who call her know they're speaking to someone who truly understands. Naomi, calling in compassion. Naomi's transformation began with exhaustion, panic attacks, insomnia, and fame that felt like captivity. She collapsed backstage one night and was treated by a nurse who whispered a prayer over her. It startled her, not the words, but the gentleness. Months later, Naomi found that same nurse at church. Their reunion became the beginning of a new life. She sold everything and trained as a counselor, starting a nonprofit that helps teenagers navigate digital exploitation. Naomi doesn't call herself a preacher. She calls herself a bridge. "Faith," she says, "was never meant to hide me from the world. It was meant to send me back into it, healed." David, identity in renewal. David entered the industry for validation. He wanted to be seen as powerful, desired, admired. But when the cameras turned off, he felt hollow. Addiction and depression followed. His turning point came when a relative invited him to a men's retreat. Surrounded by others confronting their own shame, he realized he wasn't alone. A pastor read from Romans, "Nothing can separate us from the love of God." Those words became his anchor. Today, David runs workshops teaching men how pornography distorts relationships. He speaks openly about his past, not as confession, but as education. "I don't preach purity," he says. "I preach restoration." Serena, mission and service. Serena's childhood was chaos, abuse, foster homes, and escape. By 16, she was on the streets. By 20, she was in the industry. Arrested for possession, she ended up in a rehabilitation center where Christian volunteers visited weekly. They didn't lecture, they listened. When one of them offered to help her find a safe house, Serena agreed. That small decision became the doorway to everything new. Years later, she founded an outreach called Second Light that helps at-risk teens avoid exploitation. Every week she visits the same jail she once lived in, bringing clothes, notebooks, and hope. "God didn't rescue me from jail," she says. "He turned jail into my ministry." Isla, meaning and understanding. Isla was an intellectual. Raised in church, she left faith behind in university, calling it myth for the weak. Years later, after working in adult media for nearly a decade, she stumbled upon a book about grace. It angered her and intrigued her. She began studying theology not to believe, but to understand. The more she read, the more the idea of unconditional love dismantled her cynicism. She enrolled in seminary and wrote her thesis on shame and embodiment in modern culture. Today she teaches ethics, writing about how forgiveness rebuilds moral identity. Her classroom has become her church. Caleb, creativity redeemed. Caleb worked behind the camera, filming scenes he told himself were just business. But each year his sense of empathy eroded. One night, editing footage, he broke down and deleted everything. Out of work, he wandered into a small church hosting a film workshop for teens. They needed someone who knew cameras. He stayed. That workshop became his new mission, teaching students to capture stories of hope instead of exploitation. The lens didn't change, he says. The purpose did. Today, Caleb runs a small studio producing documentaries about recovery and faith. The same skill that once distorted life now preserves it.